Welcome to the In Shape Fitness Show. I'm Coach Kim. Thank you so much for joining me. Today's podcast is called Shop But Don't Drop. 'Tis the season to shop until you drop. It's right after Thanksgiving, and the holiday season is right around the corner, and many people do just that. They shop until they drop. And after a couple of hours, something really interesting begins to happen to your body. Even relatively fit people begin to feel this just after, the 2.5, maybe 3 hour mark. You start to feel the effects of being on your feet for a long time. So this podcast is about how that fatigue happens and how it translates to pain and suffering when you keep going. Because in the holiday shopping season, you oftentimes do keep going. And maybe you're not shopping the entire time, but maybe you're running around and you're shopping for part of it. You're making food or wrapping presents or going to parties or doing whatever you're doing, but you are on your feet longer. And we're going to talk about why that happens, how that happens, and the conditions that cause it. And then, of course, we're going to talk about some exercises that you can do that will help prevent or at least delay the effects, because it'll help motivate your body or rather warm up your body before you head out for those experiences. So I'm going to start with a story. I've told this story on our podcast broadcast before, but I tell it during the holiday season because I use the terms luxury very infrequently in my life. The term luxuries and just sort of, rich and opulence, all those kinds of adjectives are really not part of my life, nor is it really part of many people's lives. We see a lot of it, on television programs and on movies and so on. But for most people, we don't live very luxurious lives. But during the holiday season, we kind of step it up a little bit. The story that I tell about luxury and the holidays tends to really shock people because it's so extreme, but I want to tell a brief version of it so that you get a sense for how significant it is to sit around and not move pretty much at all. And that is because it involves two queens, two heads of state. I like to talk about women leaders, and particularly women leaders in the 15th or 16th century, rather, in the 1500s. So Queen Elizabeth I and Mary, Queen of Scots, were cousins. They were only 9 years apart in age. Elizabeth was a little bit older than Mary. But as it turns out, Mary, Queen of Scots, was also Queen of France. When she was a teenager, she was married to the Queen of France, and he died young. So she left France, became like the Dowager or whatever, and then moved back to England or to Scotland, where she was Queen of Scotland, and Elizabeth was ruling the neighboring country of England. And it was all very rich and luxurious in terms of their everyday lives. Around the holidays in particular, the sort of approach to the celebrations, a lot of it was centered around gatherings in court and the food that they consumed and how utterly luxurious their meal times were and their gatherings at court in terms of the meat, the dishes that were brought in. I was actually reading, now this was actually at a wedding, I think, not at a holiday celebration, but there was sort of this mechanical conveyor belt that was used to bring in something like 8 or 10 courses worth of food. I mean, there were just multiple giant dishes that were really rich in terms of their, substance. There were creams and sauces and side dishes and always desserts and cheeses and breads, etc. And they only ate 2 meals back in those days, and probably for the majority of the Scottish people or the English people, this was not the case for them at all. But for the people at court, they ate these monster, luxurious, opulent sort of meals with, all the trims and trappings that we might, experience during one of our holiday meals. And ironically, both of these two queens as well were really well known for their fitness, for their health, and their vitality. Now, we would never have seen their naked bodies, their bare skin. They didn't show even much of their arms back in those days, but we know them to be very fit. They were both equestrians, and they were both really well known to outdo the men in their presence chambers and court in terms of their ability to stand up. And this largely was because of the fitness that they developed by riding horses and through archery and some of the other games that they played. But Elizabeth imprisoned Mary when Mary was just 25 or 26 years old. And Mary was still a queen. So Elizabeth, who felt real guilty about imprisoning another queen, but there was a lot of political stuff going on, I won't go into that. She felt really, really, guilty that she was imprisoning this woman. And so she afforded Mary all of these luxuries. It was a huge expense for the English crown to imprison the Queen of Scotland, but she did, and they housed her in was under house arrest essentially, in castles. They moved her a bit, and she was afforded all of her staff and all of her beautiful gowns and lots of the trappings of her luxurious life in terms of tapestries and embroidery equipment, things that she needed to have with her, the linens and the fancy beds, etc. All that was included, as was all of the fancy food. However, in fact, if you think about it, it's kind of interesting. If you think about the fact that she's a prisoner in a castle, she still has this monster staff. She still has these incredibly luxurious, rich, really heavy meals prepared for her every single day. And just her, because her husband had been murdered. The King of Scotland had been murdered, and there was a baby. Actually, one of the ironies about it is that Mary was only emerging from her maternity physicality when she was imprisoned. I think her son was about a year old, maybe a little less. But nobody else was with her, so they made these monster meals just for Mary. Anyway, so Mary wasn't allowed, however, then to ride, and they had been riding horses. They would ride every single day when they were both, in similar. They had similar freedoms. Elizabeth and Mary both literally rode horses every single day, but no longer Mary was able to do that. That was the one thing that was cut off for her completely. She was never able to ride again, and as it turns out, of course, she was only 47. It was 20 years worth of captivity for Mary, but she was, by the time she was 47 when she died, she had gained a ton of weight, as you can probably imagine. She had also, though, developed digestive problems, sleep problems, joint problems, headaches. She was depressed. She lost her hair. Her skin was sallow and saggy. So all of the microcosmic look at so many of the health, the lifestyle conditions, the pain and suffering that sedentary people today experience, we can look at gleaming through the strange lives of these two queens. And I think that story is really interesting in terms of the holiday period, because it is really, again, just around the holidays for most Americans that we even attempt some sense of luxury in terms of decorations and in terms of food, the trappings, the special, kind of extra sauces. And I mean, there are plenty of people that go out to eat for that stuff all the time. But when you're in your own home and you're celebrating with your family, we have to face it. We're pretty low key on most of that stuff for most people. But around the holidays, we try to ante it up a little bit. These queens were doing that every single day of their lives. And for one of the, to have such fitness in their lives, and then for one to be completely cut off from that, like basically taking a lion off of the African plains and sticking him in the cage, continuing to feed it the same amount of food, and then preventing it from moving around. That is what happened to Mary, Queen of Scots. But let's go back to shopping, because now I want to talk about why it is that after a couple of hours, you get tired. And it happens to everyone. It happens to fit people. It happens to sedentary people. It happens to young people. And it happens maybe even faster to slightly older people. But the thing that's interesting is that so walking is a relatively, simple activity that we do in our lives. And we do it pretty much every single day. Probably not enough as we should, but everyone knows how to walk. The thing about moving over longer periods of time is that you begin to feel some of the other muscles that happen to actually get involved in the whole walking process. And I talk to people about this with respect to running because I am a marathon coach. For years now, I have worked with and trained thousands of people to run the New York City Marathon in New York City, obviously, every year. And these are almost all recreational runners, bucket list marathoners. They are first time. Sometimes it's their only marathon that they do in their lives. And they basically can go from, a fairly sedentary existence, maybe not unfit, but definitely not marathon ready, to running a marathon. And it can be done by pretty much everyone. But the thing that happens is that the mechanics of your mobility are more than your quads and your back. And people don't tend to think about the significance of the smaller muscles that stabilize the body through locomotion. But your body is made up of hundreds of muscles, and some of the small muscles that help guide the motion, meaning the muscles that are small, that are at the top of your pelvis, and the teeny tiny, I call them finger muscles, that are deep inside your glute. So you've got the glute, which is a big muscle. I talk about the glute muscle group a lot. The gluteus maximus is that big muscle, that, meaty muscle on your butt. And that is on top of a lot of smaller muscles that are easily fatigued when you get tired. So as you're moving, within a couple of hours at the very least, you're going to begin to start to feel a sense of fatigue. Now, you don't have two sides of your body that are the same strength. Most people are right-handed. In fact, 90% of the population is right-handed, and that means that they are right dominant. Now, a right dominance means that you probably spend, not knowingly or not necessarily, this isn't necessarily a bad thing for everyday life, but because when you plant your feet in the locomotion activity, in the walking activity, or potentially running or maybe even bicycling, you're going to put a little more effort in with that stronger side. Now, this all still makes pretty good sense. It's logical, right? Well, when you're working over several hours, your left leg, especially the smaller muscles in the left leg, fatigue first. And this is why you end up with major pain later. Because when the little muscles on the left side of your body, and there are little muscles in the foot, there are small, thin muscles that line the lower leg, and then, of course, I already talked about the muscles on that help the pelvis, help direct the body in terms of the locomotion from the center of your gravity and your kinetic center, your trunk. Right at that pelvis line, there are a lot of little muscles that really help guide your legs. So when the left side begins to fatigue, guess what happens? Your gait changes. You alter the way that you're actually moving, and therefore favor the left leg even more, even though you're already doing it from the very beginning, essentially, and your right leg has to absorb more of your body weight. Now, anything that you exercise, any move where you exercise your legs independently of one another, is something that my team and I call pivoting. And we use that term to describe the priority of functional exercise, of understanding that both legs need to exercise, because both legs, when they're working, when you're moving, you're using one and then you're using the other. You're using one and then you're using the other. When you do a squat, right, which do a squat. If you're sitting down, stand up and do a squat. If you're standing up and you're just waiting for me to do have some exercises, just do squats until we move on to the next thing. But a squat or a burpee or I'm trying to think of some other exercises that might be applicable here. I mean, if you're in a gym and you're using a weight machine, there are lots of, sort of leg presses that you do, that you can do. But most of the, or all of the pivoting exercises that we define and that I want you to think about as you warm up for some of these activities will be exercises that force the left leg to work independently of the right leg and vice versa. And the reason for that is to make sure that the left leg is doing some of its work. And one way that you'll know, actually, if you've been doing squats, you can stop, because here's a really good, really fast assessment that everyone can do to just get a sense of how different the strength is on one side or the other. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean anything in terms of your fitness, but fitness is not like a vertical sort of category of who you are as a human being. It covers lots of different things. So your balance is really important, and it really doesn't necessarily mean anything in terms of your ability to go out and do stuff. But if you stand on your right leg, so lift your left leg up off of the floor, now for 10 seconds, close your eyes. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and open your eyes. Were you able to do it? You should be able to hold for 10 seconds. If you cannot, try standing on your leg. You can even do it with one, with your eyes open. You can also do it with one hand on the back of a chair. You can even, if you're just I do this all the time on the subway platform in New York City. I'm probably one of the goofiest people you might see if you check people out while they're standing around waiting for subway trains. I'm that crazy person standing on one leg or doing something goofy like an exercise I call the forward reach or the bird feeder, where I reach down to the floor with one hand because I'm constantly wanting to make sure that my left side and my right side are balanced. Anyway, but try that. Balance it out. And of course, now let's do the other side. So your left leg is stable on the floor. You're going to pick up the right leg for 10 seconds. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and again, open your eyes. It's probably harder to stabilize on your left leg. Now, there are exceptions to this blanket rule. This is not a blanket rule, in fact. If you have, but it's related in that if you have been an exerciser and you have some experience with either a running program maybe, or bicycling, or maybe you're just a person who spends a lot of time on an elliptical machine. In fact, I have a client who had this happen to her. Your right leg, because of the undue imbalance between the right leg and the left leg and the amount of effort expended by the right leg, you might end up with an injury to the right leg, in which case you end up with a little bit of transference. You might develop some strength in the left leg as a result of the damage that you do to the right leg. Our bodies are really, really amusing to think about, some of the goofy stuff that happens to us. But at least we're living, we're alive, we're enjoying ourselves, and we're talking still now about shopping, but not dropping. So the pivoting thing and the balance, those are the two sort of functional priorities that you should be thinking about in conjunction with your preparations to go out and shop during the holiday season. Now, there is another factor, of course, that is always a big issue for people, and that's core strength. So let's just call it what it is. A plank a day is important. An apple a day is important. There's the 10,000 steps rule thing. Maybe I'll do that next week. I think next week I'll talk about the funny story I found for my book about the sort of the beginnings of that 10,000 step a day recommendation and how that came about, because it has to do with the 1964 Olympics, and it's quite an interesting story. So tune in next week for that. But let's do a plank. If you're not in plank, get into plank. You're going to go for 30 more seconds. Time starts now. We're at 20 minutes into the podcast. I like to try to keep these to about 25 minutes. So I've got to have you do a plank, and then we're going to turn over and do some bridges with your hips. And once we get through with that, I will let you go for the day. 10 seconds. You're almost there. But a plank a day. I'm telling you, roll out of bed. No, don't roll out of bed. Don't do anything. Don't put your feet on the floor in the morning before you roll over and lift your body up into a plank. You can do a plank on your bed. You're done, by the way, with your plank now. Turn over and bend your knees and put your feet flat on the floor and lift your hips up into the air. Seriously, you can just turn off instead of hitting the snooze, turn your body once your alarm clock goes off in the morning. Turn over. Prop your body up with your elbows and lift up your body, and you don't have any control over it. You don't have to do anything. You just have to hold it there. And within 20 to 30 seconds, you're going to feel all of that tightening of the muscle tissue, the heat driven back to the center of your body. And that center activation is going to stimulate your limbs, your heart rate, and help you wake up with a better sense of what's up for the day. I guarantee it. Okay, now you're in hip bridge. The cool thing about hip bridge is that there are so many different variations of it. I call them hip bridge variations. In fact, I'm such a creative exercise namer, aren't I? So hip bridges are pretty simple in that you lower down and you lift up. Now, there's a really, really significant error that a lot of people make. And the reason that they make it is because the muscle on the front of your legs, the thigh, which is 4 muscles actually, it's called the quadricep. That muscle group, I call it the bully of your body because it takes over almost any exercise. The thighs, the quads can help and or take over pretty much any of your movements in terms of your legs. And you, with your hip bridge exercise, you want to make sure that your hip flexors are completely stretched out and flat, and you want to make sure that your feet are flat on the floor, because if your toes come up off the floor, that means that you have disengaged the back of the body, and now you're only using the quads and your lower back. So keep those toes down. The other thing that you can do for the variations, and this goes back to pivoting, is to lift up one leg and exercise in the bridge with just one leg. So you can lift up your left leg and do dips, so lowering the butt down and up, or you can move the left leg by tapping your toes down and up, whether your knee is bent and you're tapping with the pointed toes, or you can even keep your leg straight and lower the leg straight down and tap the floor with your heels with the straight left leg. Lots of different variations, but enjoy shopping more and longer when you will enjoy shopping more and longer. Or maybe you don't enjoy shopping at all. I don't. But if you go out and you want to enjoy yourself over a couple of hours without feeling like, you can't move, that you have to rest, you should warm up before you go. Do those. We talked about lunges. We talked about squats, then you did a plank, and now you're doing hip bridges, and you did some balance work. That's enough. 5 exercises. That's it. So come back next week. We're going to talk about that 10,000 step a day rule and how it was derived, we think, from the 1964 Olympics. I'm Coach Kim from InShape Fitness. Now, you can get in touch with me and my team at bodybyInShape.com. There's a Contact Us page there if you have any questions or thoughts, or you need our help in any way, shape, or form. Please let us know. And I will see you again real soon. Have a wonderful day.